Hello, and thanks for joining me on yet another worm update. This week, I am looking for what the moisture content looks to be in the bins. With the weather getting warmer and the humidity getting higher, it seems that my bins have gotten damper than they have been throughout the winter, especially in the regular tote bins that I have. So I've been trying to keep just the bubble wrap on my regular totes. I don't put the lid on the bins at all. I just keep the bubble wrap and the rest open. Not really concerned about the worms getting out. They are happy in the soil and they actually are encouraged to stay in the bin when there isn't a lid because they don't like the light. But I'm showing you here the consistency of the bin. It is drying out, but it still is holding a lot of moisture. Where it came from, it is much drier than where it had been a couple weeks ago, but I did note that with the uptick in the weather, the water and moisture content did increase as well. So I am going to continue to leave the lid off of these bins. And I know I say I'm going to get the screen, but I did purchase the mosquito screen. I'm going to start using that instead of the lid. That way I can make sure that no pests fly in. Another thing that has happened with spring being upon us is that the bugs, the gnats and fruit flies, are also coming in to the house, and I do not want to encourage them. So I am going to try to put the mosquito screening over it just to make sure that the bugs stay out. Beyond the issue with moisture, as I seem to always have, these bins look good. No major food chunks left, so I'm going to give the bin a normal feeding, and after that just cover it up and it is set up for the next week. Moving over to the second regular tote. In this one, I'm leaving the lid on, but I'm doing no bubble wrap. It's kind of like my own experiment to see what works better. And upon initial observation, it definitely stays a lot wetter in this bin. Like, this bin is mushy. The worms are happy. They don't care. And I guess I shouldn't care that they don't care, but still, I don't like the bins to run too wet. My first bins I had, the very first year I had worms, they ran on the wetter side. And as the castings continued to be produced and the weeks went on, it just got heavier and heavier and muddy. And the process of harvesting was so hard on those first two bins that I had. So that's really the reason why I am concerned with the moisture content, not because of just a personal preference, but when it comes to harvesting your castings, the heavier and wetter castings don't go through the sifters. The worms tend not to migrate through them. And it just makes it overall easier to do the harvest if you have the bins just a little bit drier. Not completely dry, not crunchy, but if there's less overall moisture, the process of drying the castings out becomes a lot easier. So this bin, I'm starting to realize, is not going to work as it is. And I made the decision to go ahead and just put the bubble wrap and do the same thing that I'm doing with the other bin with this bin, as it is seeming to pull the moisture out. Moving over to the first of my two Vermi bag totes. If this is your first time joining me, I will let you know that I prefer the Vermi Totes, because it does allow for the air to evenly circulate around all the castings, and they don't tend to hold as much moisture as the regular totes. But this one I am taking to a harvesting stage, so I'm not going to be adding any more cardboard to this bin. And the worms are loving the castings. They were eating on something, so there was a huge worm ball just at the top, but they are very happy in this bin. As I'm taking it to harvest, it's very important that I get all the way down to the bottom and make sure the castings are getting mixed up, because I don't want to leave any chunks at the bottom. I don't want the bottom to get muddy, so I do try to make sure it gets fluffed really well before giving it any food. And as I'm going through, I'm just finding tons and tons of worms everywhere, which is a good thing. With this bin moving towards harvest, I want to encourage the worms to go through and start processing any of the cardboard remnants and any food remnants that are in here. So starting next week, I am going to lessen the amount of fresh food that I give it. I don't completely starve the bin, where there are some who choose to not feed the bin at all for 2 to 3 weeks before it goes to harvest. I just stopped giving it as large of a feeding as I normally would, to encourage them to go after those other pieces. And then once I felt that it's broken down enough, that's when I transfer it to the harvest and use the bait trays. So with this one, it's still going to get a normal feeding, but I'm not going to add any cardboard to it, and then it's set up for the next week. Now, the conditions in the second Vermi bag tote are drastically different than the conditions in the first one, namely because I did add cardboard to this. I made the decision to add the cardboard because the content level was too low, and I'm not trying to waste the energy in sifting when I won't get a lot of castings out of it. So these castings at the bottom are true black gold, but they will not be harvested for some time. And the texture in the bin was a mixture. The cardboard was damp, but it was mostly dry, and the castings were wetter. So again, in the Vermi tote, I am mixing it well. I don't want that cardboard layer to just sit at the top and leach all the moisture off of the castings and end up with dry castings. So I'm going to do a good job of mixing this in. And since I am not trying to take this into any harvest period, I'm just going to give this bin a regular feeding, because as I was sifting through, I didn't find a lot of food particles. I found a lot of happy worms, but I didn't find large food particles. I did find some, but not enough to make me say I needed to skip this feeding period for the worms, because there was more food than I like in there. So I just gave it a regular feeding and put the bubble wrap back over it and set it up for the next week. Moving over to my one and only flow-through system, the Vermi Bag Mini. This particular bin I do deal with differently because it's not a tote and you're always feeding the bin from the top. You're never really messing with the middle or the bottom. You really don't want to dig down into the Vermi Bag Mini. So the goal in this one is always to keep the worms at the top, and typically you really don't have to do much to have that happen. My worms stay where the food is, and that's where they're the happiest. But I do note that the edges of this towards the top are a bit crunchy. So here, what I'm doing is just trying to take everything that's in the side and move it towards the center, towards where it is a bit wetter than over on the outside. And I don't dig down too far. Again, I only go to about the middle of my palm and turn it over. I try to leave what's down below alone. And I'm looking for the worms, and they all seem to be good sized worms. There's one of them there. They're nice size, they're happy, they're not crawling along the edges of the actual fabric. They're just hanging out in the bubble wrap, getting some air. So in this one, to encourage the worms to stay towards the top, hey kitty, to encourage the worms to stay towards the top, I'm going to give it a good size feeding, something larger than I normally would. Now, even though I don't like to go through starvation periods, I don't mind giving the Vermi Bag Mini a larger feeding and then skipping a week if necessary. So that's why I'm going with a larger feeding now, and it's a mixture of items that carry a lot of moisture, like squash and peppers, and then banana peels, which will last longer. A banana peel may hang out in your bin for anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. So the food here are items which will help out with the moisture content, but also something that will be around for a little bit for them to hang out on. Since I am concerned about the edges, I'm also going to wet down the bin, add a little bit of moisture to it in hopes that it's not as dry as it has been. After doing all of that, it's the usual, by now, just giving it the grit, putting the bubble wrap on, and closing it up for the next week. And that completes this week's video. I hope you've enjoyed the content. Thanks for sticking to the end, and if you'd like to view more, just click the link for another recommended video. Thanks for watching.